Good evening. Good evening. Yeah. Welcome to Anderson Ranch Arts Center. My name is Esther, and I'm the studio coordinator for Photography New Media. And I want to welcome everyone, including our virtual participants who are watching from afar, and our Board of Trustees and National Council members. We thank you deeply for your support. Before we begin, I have a favor to ask. If everyone could take out your phone and silence it, please, so we don't disrupt our speakers this evening. I'll do the same. Before we begin, I also want to remind everyone that tomorrow at 8:45 a.m. there will be an all-campus orientation. Lots of good information about the weekend events, so please make sure to not miss that. And again, we'll be right here at 8:45. I want to start by recognizing that the Anderson Ranch campus resides on the traditional ancestral territory of the Ute people, who called the Roaring Fork Valley home and for over 800 years. Through our mission to promote a wide range of arts, cultures, and voices, we commit to partner with and honor the indigenous ancestors and residents of the sacred land where we learn, walk, and create. Tonight's program will consist of 2 faculty, and then we will have a Q&A at the end, so please have your questions ready. First up, we have faculty Jess T. Dugan. Jess is an artist and writer whose work explores the complexities of personhood, relationships, desire, love, and family. While their practice is centered around photography, it also includes writing, video, sound, drawing, and installation. Their work is informed by their own life experiences, including their identity as a queer and non-binary person, and reflects a deep belief in the importance of representation and the transformative power of storytelling. Their work is regularly exhibited internationally and is in the permanent collection of over 60 museums. Their books include Look at Me Like You Love Me, To Survive on the Shore, photographs of and interviews with transgender and non-gender conforming older adults, and Every Breath We Drew. They are currently working on Love Pictures, a survey book made in collaboration with Charlotte Cotton, which will be published by Radius Books in 2026. They have been a visiting artist at the Anderson Ranch Art Center here, the Hermitage Artist Retreat, and Lightwork. They're a recipient of a Pollock Krasner Foundation grant, an ICP Infinity Award, and were selected by the Obama White House as an LGBT Artist Champion of Change. Please help me welcome Jess.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Excellent. Thank you so much, Esther, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to Esther and Andrea and everyone at the ranch for inviting me here. This is one of my most favorite places ever. In fact, if I tell you how much I love it, I'll cry, so I'm going to wait. We're going to save the crying for later in the week. But I'm very happy to be back here, and thank you all so much for coming tonight. I'm going to share with you 3 projects that I'm currently working on and give you an overview of my practice. So I've been making photographs for 20 years now in a serious capacity, and my work has always been the way that I understand myself and the world around me and the way that I connect with other people. And even over those 20 years, my work has really centered around this central question, this central theme of how do we come to know ourselves deeply on an intimate level, and then how do we connect with other people from that place? So the work I'm showing you in this selection is new work that I've been making since 2022, and 2022 is when I published my last monograph, Look at Me Like You Love Me, that Esther mentioned. And the way that I work is very long-term, so I am always making photographs, and this is what I consider to be the 3rd chapter in my lifelong, ongoing soul work. And I have a mind to my students when I'm giving these talks, but for me, the way that I think about a book or an exhibition is really like putting a chapter of this work out into the world. But for me, my practice of making photographs is lifelong, and each project feeds into the next project. The way that I work with my subjects is very slow and collaborative, and consent and trust are really important to me. I work with the same people over a period of many, many years. I photograph slowly. My camera's often on a tripod. One of my students already asked me, what are we doing with the tripod? And I said, making portraits. I always use a tripod, and I work with natural light. I think a lot about the color and the mood behind the photographs. One shift in this newer work is a move toward landscape. I've always made portraits, and I've always made still life images, but in the past they've been things like flowers or two pillows, things that come into contact with the body. This is actually here on one of our field trips at the ranch. And in this newer work, I'm bringing in a lot more landscape as a background for the portraits, but also as its own subject. I photograph a lot in and around Provincetown, Massachusetts. I spend time there in the summer. I'm from the Boston area and also teach in Provincetown. And it's one of my favorite places to make work, in part because it's such a creative space. It's also a very queer space, but it's also near the water, and the water has become a really significant part of my work. Something I think about a lot in my photographs is a kind of duality between beauty and loss. And for me, the water kind of references this duality of thinking about how it's simultaneously always there and ever present, but it's also always changing, just as we are. So my work is often goodness. My work is often talked about, I was thinking of two words at the same time, in terms of queerness, and I've worked a lot within queer communities, and I'm deeply passionate about and committed to representation of queer people, of queer communities, of queer lives. I work a lot within my own communities. But as my work has developed and gone along, for me it's become about these larger existential questions of relationships and love and time. And something I'm thinking a lot about right now in my practice is time, and how we have a limited time here, how we have a limited time with each other. And the flip side of that is this desire, this request to live really urgently and authentically and fully. So I often photograph early in the morning or late in the day. This was actually made here at the ranch in 2023, and for me that quickly shifting light references this impending change, this temporality, and also this vibrancy of being fully alive. I photograph myself in my work a lot. This has always been a part of my practice, going back to my very earliest pictures were of myself and the community I was in. And again, I've always used the camera as a way to understand myself. And I feel like it's really important to include myself in my work for a couple of reasons. One is it really shares with the viewer who I am, the perspective I'm coming from, the lens through which I'm making this work. But also, and I think more importantly, I share a lot of myself in my self-portrait work, and I tell my own story. And by doing that sharing and doing that telling, it invites a space for people to reciprocate with me, which is a really huge part of my work and really essential to my practice. I've also been thinking a lot in recent years about representing queerness and queer lives in nature, in expansive spaces. In my earlier work, I was often working in people's homes or in interiors, and increasingly I've moved outdoors. And on some level, this was a visceral move. I really love working outside. I also did this initially to kind of throw a wrench in my own photographic practice and mix up the kind of images I was making. But it's really come to be significant that it's depicting queerness in these open natural spaces, and also relating queerness to things like the sea and the trees and the sky and the land. I'm very influenced by art history, and in particular portrait painting. And sometimes I feel that my photographs are actually more in dialogue with painting than other photographs, and I pull very carefully from color, light, gesture, pose, and I use these things to create an emotional portrait, a psychological portrait. I've always been very interested in making pictures that go beyond the surface of who we are, to talk about something more psychological, to talk about something more internal. And I think a lot about how we read these very complicated things like identity and gender and sexuality and desire and vibrancy of life, how we read all of these things through the exterior of someone's body, but they're these very complex interior experiences. This was also made here at the ranch. I feel compelled to tell you everything I made here at the ranch, so we'll see what comes this week. I've also been photographing a lot in Missouri. I live in St. Louis, Missouri, and I've been photographing in rural Missouri, which is where this portrait was made. And part of this work for me is also about reclaiming a natural landscape as a queer person and taking back this permission to be in these spaces that have historically not felt safe or not felt affirming. So I am increasingly interested in queerness in rural environments as well. So here's an installation view of this work to give you a sense of how it exists in space. This was an exhibition from 2023 in Santa Fe, and you can see that the way the photographs are hung is somewhat organic. They're organized by color and mood and emotion. I think a lot about the sequence of my photographs, and I think about how each one has a different emotional note, similar to a musical score, and how I can play with that in the exhibition space and in the book space to really create an experience for a viewer. I've been increasingly thinking about making immersive installation spaces. This is an exhibition I had last year at the Ringling Museum in Sarasota. And again, the hang is somewhat organic. I put a seating area in. I'm kind of on a mission to have these comfortable seating areas in my exhibitions. But I really wanted to invite people to stay, to spend time, to linger. You can see on the wall there's a video still. I have 2 autobiographical videos about my family. One is about my estrangement from my father, and one is about my journey to becoming a parent. And those coexist with my photographs. And then this exhibition also had an audio soundtrack of texts I wrote alongside my photographs in Look at Me Like You Love Me, overlaid with ocean waves recorded at a specific beach in Provincetown, and that filled the space. So I'm just thinking so much about this immersive space. I'm thinking about narrative and storytelling and bringing all of these elements together. This is an exhibition I have on view in Milan right now at a venue called Gallery d'Italia. And I worked with a curator in Milan who comes from a photojournalism background, and in part because Milan is so conservative, she really wanted to highlight the identity element. So there were 30 portraits. There were no still lifes. They were all the same size, the same scale, and it was really about foregrounding queer representation and trans representation in a space where it really has been seen not nearly as much as it has here. So there's always been an educational aspect to my work, an activist mission to my work, as well as coming from this very deep, personal, subjective place. So the second project I'm going to share with you is called Family Pictures. I've been making this work with my family since 2012. All of my projects are very long-term. This one in particular, I imagine as being decades. I imagine publishing a book in 15 years. But it includes myself, my former partner Vanessa, and our daughter Eleanor, who's here in this image, and then also my mom and her wife. So I've been making these pictures, as I said, for 13 years, and my photographs have always been part of my life, so it was a very natural extension of my work. And I had been photographing myself, I had been photographing Vanessa, and then we had a daughter, Eleanor, and as I naturally do, I started making pictures of her and with her. This is the first picture I made of her. She was 2 days old in the hospital, and it was a very natural part of my process, and I realized fairly quickly when I started showing them how little representation there is of queer families and queer parenting. And that has also become a very significant part of this work. So this is a self-portrait with my mom. This was made in 2012. And something I'm really interested in this work right now is looking at the 3 generations and also the passage of time, but thinking about how I am the queer, non-binary adult child of an aging lesbian parent and simultaneously the parent of a young child, and how all of those things overlap and intersect. I mentioned in the previous work that I often photograph the same people over time, but in this work, the passage of time is really an integral part of the work. I'm interested in how we change. I'm interested in relationships over time. I often return to the same places. I'm certainly returning to the same people, but often return to the same place as well. So there's something really essential about looking at time and thinking about, again, this limited time we have with each other and what we choose to do with it. This is my mom and her wife, Chris. And in the earlier images, like the one of me laying on my mom's lap, I was very much thinking of those from the point of view of a child and thinking of, her only as my mother. And then once I became a parent, I felt like I had this sort of dual vision where I could imagine it differently from different directions, and the picture started to change. So this is one where I really see that coming through, where instead of her holding me, I'm holding her and kind of thinking about what is ahead for us and how our relationships will continue to change as we both age. It's very challenging to photograph a toddler. I don't know how many of you have tried, but I didn't change my equipment. My equipment's fairly slow, so this was made when she was 2, and it was like a small miracle. I got a picture on this day, but once she turned 4, she started to learn to pose, so it's become a little bit easier. But it's been a really interesting process to learn to work with her. This is actually the first picture I made of me and my mom where I really started to feel our relationship changing. And I mentioned returning to place. So this is actually the same location on a beach in Provincetown where the other portrait of them was made. And there's become something, the place and location and landscape has become really important to me, not only as an environment, but as this sort of ritual of going back to the same place over time. It's almost like a touchstone of how other things have changed. So I have been making this work for 13 years, and I didn't show any of it until the first 10. So I started exhibiting it in 2022, and this was one of the first exhibitions. This is a show called Designing Motherhood at the Mass Art Museum, and I loved my work being included in the show because it was an exhibition about motherhood and parenthood and reproductive justice more broadly. So I get very excited when my work crosses out of only the capital A art world and into other subjects and other fields and can have an impact in that space. This was the first more significant exhibition of this work I had at the National Portrait Gallery in 2022, and it was a group show, but each artist had their own room, so it was this kind of singular presentation of this work, and I was really struck, this is so obvious in hindsight, but I was struck by how many people go to an institution like the National Portrait Gallery. I mean, we'll see what's happening now, which is a rabbit hole I shouldn't even go down, but it was very significant to have visibly queer work in that space, and they also published this catalog and put the self-portrait of me and Eleanor on the front, and I thought it was very meaningful that an institution such as that would have a very visibly queer image as the front of the catalog. And then this is the most recent exhibition of this work. This is at the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth in an exhibition called Diaries of Home. Again, I keep trying to avoid politics, but this was in the space where the Sally Mann photographs were exhibited and seized recently, so it also became this kind of loaded exhibition in this political space. And I have always, as I said, had an activist mission and a political mission, but I think at this moment that's pressure is being put on that even more so, and it certainly feels like an unprecedented time for me as an artist and a kind of worrisome time for our field. But I did love this exhibition before the FBI came. So the last project I'm going to show you is actually not photography. So I hope that's not blasphemous while teaching a photography workshop. But it's called I'm Right Here With You. And This is a series of drawings that I began at the end of 2023. And I originally started this project as a way to begin my mornings with a meditative practice. I was finding I was waking up every day, I was opening Instagram, I was opening email, and I was just starting my day anxious. And so I decided to draw plants and flowers early in the morning. I draw every day, usually between 5 and 6 before my daughter wakes up. And within a few weeks, I realized I was making a serious body of work, and this had really become a part of my practice. So I always draw from life, and I often draw the same plant or flower or bouquet from full vibrancy all the way through to its complete decay. And I realized as I was making this work that even though it's a completely different medium, I'm actually interested in all of the same questions that I'm asking in my photography. Again, I'm thinking about time, I'm thinking about mortality, I'm thinking about presence and how we can be really present for each other. A huge theme in my photographs is the idea of the power of being seen and what it means to truly let yourself be seen by another person, to truly see another person, and how that kind of recognition can be so life-affirming, so validating. And I came to that experience through queerness, through queer communities, but I do think it's also a universal experience. And so this work in its own way is about a kind of close looking, it's about a presence, it's about a reflection on love and relationships and time. So I've just had my first exhibition of this work, and it was only the drawings. I'll show you pictures in a few minutes, but I'm excited to start integrating them with my photographs because it's really just an extension of a lot of the questions that I'm asking and a lot of the things that I'm thinking about in my practice as a whole. I don't know how well they're reading on the screen. I hope you can see them okay. They're also dated, as you can see. They're titled by the name of the flower and dated. There's two sizes of drawings. These are 22 by 30 inches. And then there's also a smaller scale, 9 by 12 inches. And the 9 by 12 inch series is numbered. So it's drawing number 1, tulips, and the date. And so in a way, there's also a kinship with how I make my photographs. It's this very long-term serial undertaking. And I think of it as being about the process and about the sort of life-affirmingness of making art, of creating, rather than being about one specific piece. So here are a few installation views of an exhibition I have up currently of the drawings. This is at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation in St. Louis, Missouri, and you can see the different scales in this work and how they coexist. And similar to my photographs, I was thinking a lot about the sequence and the rhythm of them emotionally and how they exist in the space and how a viewer would move through that space. I also intentionally designed this exhibition as a space for reflection. Something that I always want to happen in my exhibitions is for a viewer to engage with the work, but then as a result of that, to reflect on their own lives, their own selves, their own identities, their own desires. And so it's really meant to be this sort of activating presence. Similar to the Ringling exhibition, I also intentionally put in a seating area in the Pulitzer show as an invitation to stay. It's 2 chairs on purpose. They're comfortable on purpose because a lot of museum chairs are not comfortable. But it was really meant as an invitation to stay and talk. And I was pleasantly surprised while the show was up, the chairs were often full. It worked how I intended it to. So I'm going to end it there, and I look forward to questions later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jess. Next up, we have Paul Anthony Smith. Paul Anthony Smith is a Jamaican-born, New York-based artist who explores themes of post-diasporic identity, community, cultural memory through his paintings and photography. After studying ceramics at the Kansas City Art Institute, Smith moved to New York City in 2014, where he now lives and works. Smith is represented by Jack Shaman in New York and Timothy Taylor Gallery in London. So please help me welcome Paul Anthony Smith to the stage.
Thank you for that introduction. Good evening. I'm glad to be back at the ranch. It's been a number of years. I first came to the ranch in 2009 as a student in a workshop, followed by residency and visiting artists, and a few other times since then. A lot has happened. And here I will, kind of take you down the past 15 years of works that I've made. A lot of my recent works aren't included, but it's more so segments to get to where I am right now. And please bear with me because I lost my voice earlier this week, so it's now coming back. But I studied ceramics at the Kansas City Art Institute and graduated in 2010. And at that time, I was sort of like confronted with trying to understand, what do I do now? Now that I've left Jamaica, moved to America, lived in the Midwest, gone to school, what should I do? And I think 2 years after that, I came to the ranch and did a ceramic residency. And I think that became a turning point for my work, where I sort of like left the ceramic field and began working with photography and printmaking and sort of collage materials. At that time, I was painting. I was making paintings in my studio in Kansas City. And I was looking back at photographs from my parents' albums, looking back at the 80s and what my parents were doing, thinking about my father working on a cruise ship. And so I was making paintings from these photographs and trying to get a sense of who I was and who I'm going to be. And these are acrylic on canvas. And even though I studied ceramics, I was learning about painting. And I'm painting on my own, It wasn't a formal, I didn't really have formal painting training. And these works range in size, anywhere from 12 by 15 to 60 by 50. And then I went back home to Jamaica. I started looking at the tarmac workers and trying to understand who they are and their posture, because I realized there was a difference whenever I got back home compared to being in Miami or Kansas City. There was a different gesture, a different calmness, the stillness of these individuals working. And these paintings were 72 by 60 inches. And here I'm trying to paint on a 1-to-1 ratio. And for me, it was more so trying to think about the history of the Caribbean and how I, became this person. It's like, we all come from somewhere, but you ever wonder, like, how did you become who you are? And try to understand who you are from stories that you've been told. And also being an immigrant, I was questioning these things all at the same time. And around that same time, I was making these picotage, which is what I developed here at the ranch, where I began picking on, I began using my ceramic tool to pick and scratch into the photographic surface of prints, which I was printing in the photo department. And I was making drawings of the Kuba mask that talks about hierarchy of life, the rise and fall of leaders. And here, my mother was in London at the time sending me her extra passport photos from her visa. And I began scanning them and drawing over them and sort of disguising her identity behind these masks, which I didn't, inform her that I was doing. It was kind of like me thinking about her struggles. And eventually I showed them in Dallas at the McKinney Avenue Contemporary. These are around 24 by 32 inches. And I was simultaneously showing them and presenting them with the tarmac workers that speaks about immigration. A lot of my images has to do with family and thinking about lives lost and stories of how I've become who I am, and how my identity is created from these stories. And I began, taking photographs, going back home to Jamaica and taking photographs of people in the community and family members, and sort of, I never felt comfortable revealing their identity through the photos, so I would sort of disguise their features by picking away and really trying to think about scarification and how it's sometimes celebratory in the way that we use tattoos and piercings to celebrate a coming of age. And then the images began being picked fully. And these are 50 by 30 inches. And now I'm playing with scale where these are now 60 by 50. And these prints, collages, actually started here at the ranch, where I was silk screening my photographs in this sort of grayscale black and white tone. And I was cutting them up and trying to sort of like recreate these puzzle pieces, sort of like how a lot of the structures back home were created, where buildings and houses had add-ons and additions from different generations, where one structure didn't fit from the past 15 years. It was like new families always adding on to what's already been in place. And it's also something I began noticing while I'm living in New York and going back home and seeing and starting to question that, like, why are things the way they are, They seem a bit confused. And I presented some of these works with this cinder block wall because I was curious about just the tones, the structure, and also I needed a placeholder within the exhibition to sort of like speak more about the work, and also trying to gain the similar texture from the silk screen on canvas. And a lot of these works at the time are all based on photographs that I've been picking into the surface, which I call picotage. Each one of these works about 60 by 40 inches. Picotage on inkjet prints. And I was invited to the Providence College to do a project called On the Wall. And I decided to recreate this wall of images that sort of reflected my travels going back home to Jamaica. And they're mainly images of things I did on my daily commute, or images I wanted to capture as part of the memory. And it's also, the images are also placed in the cinder block patterns. And then I was invited to do an exhibition in Milan at a gallery, and I decided to sort of break down my photographs into sort of these quadrants of colors using oil stick on canvas. And the colors are very much reflective of the information from the photographs. And I did this because at the time I had an iPhone that I never updated, so whenever I would receive text messages, the images would come in very slow and it wouldn't load properly. And so it forced me to really think about the low bandwidth, but also making these paintings in this sort of like signature gesture. Living in Brooklyn at the time, I was thinking often about gentrification, credit card payments, student loan payments, and how often we don't read the fine prints in these things that we sign off on. And so in some ways, I was signing off on these paintings without, reading the contract. And it's more so thinking about the jargon that lawyers write, that lawyers are the ones who are able to decipher them. And the paintings are called Blurred Lines, 84 by 60 inches. For me, it's just part of the studio practice is making work, Whenever I have an idea, I run through these ideas until, they're sort of like stable to present. But a lot of it goes back to how I see the Caribbean and my questions of the Caribbean, such as Carnival in Trinidad or also the West Indian Day Parade in Brooklyn. And what is that, How do we celebrate us? At the same time, we think about immigration and walls and protecting walls, putting walls up. It's sort of like this toll. These are 96 by 47. And so the white that you're seeing is me using a ceramic tool to pick into the surface of these photographs, which is very much time consuming. But it's sort of this dance in the studio where the works are changing in this lenticular lens when moving from left to right or right to left. I think this one is called Seeing Blind, Hearing Deaf, which is a saying that was told a lot to us growing up in the Caribbean. See things and don't say anything about them. And this one's called Visibility Comes at a Cost. I think invisibility comes at a cost. And this is a large painting that's printed on inkjet print and cut up and sewn back together in this sort of patchwork collage style, and then I spray painted a chain link fence over that. It's about 8 feet wide, 60 by 80, 96, 60 by 96 inches. And then around 2018, 2019, I began taking more, capturing more images from the West Indian Day Parade and really trying to think about the 13 stripes and what that is. I must say that my images aren't great on screen. You have to see them in person because there's sculptural, textural quality to them that you can't see on screen, that they're sort of like three planes, from picking from left and right, and then also the flat plane of the print. So I was thinking about the 13 stripes of the American flag and new Americans and new immigrants in this image. And then looking at architectural elements from the Caribbean and thinking about breeze blocks and how air is these blocks are designed for air to flow through them. And so I was using those patterns as a way to sort of like pick over these photographs and disguise the images underneath them. And during this time, I think, I'm always making other works in the studio that I'm waiting to sort of like develop for them to be seen. I think this is called Midnight Blue, 96 by 72. And when I made these works, I'm really thinking about spirits, duppies, ghosts, apparitions from the Caribbean, and how sort of these dancers sort of replicate some of those identities. And here on the right is where you could see where I'm picking in different patterns versus the left side. And I'm also using paint on the surface of those works. This work, I think, is Junction from a number of years ago at Jack Shainman Gallery. Or Trade Winds, excuse me. Trade Winds, where I've gone to other Caribbean islands and really trying to capture the essence of them and think about the history of the Caribbean. I believe this was like right during COVID in 2021. Image on the right is a family photo. Image on the left is one that I captured myself. But up close, you could see other islands in some of the photographs that are picked into the surface in sort of this camouflage pattern. This is a larger work, 104 by 72 by 104, called Dog and Duppy Drink Rum. Again, the duppy, the ghost, the spirit, the person who has passed on is also present, taking part in the festivities. And I often use Photoshop in my works where I'm cutting and collaging figures together to put them in scenes. And these are Eye for the Tropics. Really trying to think about the quest for the tropics, Kodak moments. How do we look at the Caribbean? Do we see blue water, blue sky, or how do we think about the people in the Caribbean, And try to think about them as these windows of view. And then these are the more recent work, called Dreams Deferred, based off of Langston Hughes' poem, A Dreams Deferred. What happens to a dreams deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like a rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like syrup sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? So I started making these works around 2016, but also when I first moved to New York, you start to really think about how difficult New York can be to live in and sort of make a life in. And I began to think about the American dream and what that is and how it's sometimes hard to maintain because we see these athletes, every season there's a new sporting event on the screen. We watch TV, then the draft happened, and every year I'm like, I pray and hope that all these athletes that make it in the draft are here for next season because, there's always one or two of them that pass away from stupidity or accidents. And it's sort of like you have to really think about how do you maintain the American dream or just the dream and the legacy? How do you preserve that? And this is what I'm trying to convey in these works, They're often floral elements that really think about that I use as memento moris, but they're often behind fences where you sort of have to reach behind the fences, and the fences are obstacles. You have to overcome those obstacles to move forward. And this is a presentation from the Hyde collection in Glens Falls, New York. This was January 2024. And I also included these landscapes. And so I made these paintings. I made about 100 of these paintings, and I think I had 9 good ones. And it's very hard to use the ink from the Epson cartridge to paint on these arches paper. Because sometimes, there's all these tricks that I was trying to work out to get these smooth transitions painting on the floor in my studio. And I'd make a couple of these a day. Some days I would get frustrated and leave the studio. But it was the act of making these landscapes. These were also dreams that I've had. I would have dreams of just being out on the water. And it goes back to those early paintings I showed you of my father working on the cruise ships as a bellboy. But both my parents worked on the cruise ships back in the 1980s. And so, because those are my formative memories, I'm always thinking about the water. Even when I lived in Kansas City, I would dream about the water at night, dark blue water, light blue water, all different kinds of waters. And so I'm always thinking about the water. I can never live back in the Midwest now. Like, I have to be by a body of water, even if it's the dirty Harlem River in New York. I have to be by the water. I have to see the water because that's where I'm most at ease. Even walking on the trail earlier, like I love hearing the stream of the water. It's kind of calming and therapeutic for me, and it brings me back to this idea of home. It's also referencing Hiroshi Sugimoto's photos of the water in places that he's traveled around the world, the landscape. It's this sort of like equilibrium for me. And this is from my most recent exhibition last fall at Jack Shaman Gallery. The work on the right I started in 2017. I never showed it until I stretched it and presented it last fall. But it's a two-sided work, On one hand, it's looking at the palm trees, coconut trees of the Caribbean, but also when turned sideways, if you look at it sideways, you can turn your head, you can see that it's people walking through a graveyard. And a lot of these resorts and, hotels in the Caribbean, I often think about how many of them are built on graveyards or, ancestral land or land that, people no longer get to claim. These paintings are both printed on my inkjet printer, but they're painted over. The one on the right is spray painted over with spray paint, and the one on the left I've used oil paint to paint over that, but also using oil slicks on the oil brush and painting with a brush. But a lot of the paintings and works that I make, I use photography and printing as part of the making process, the painting process, and trying to extract a lot of information from it. Same thing with the work on the left, the blue work. It's called Dream Book, I believe. That was printed here at the ranch in 2017. I started at McDowell Colony residency, where I painted on these paintings, and then I came here to the ranch probably like a month later and silkscreen over them. And I feel like a lot of the works that I've made over the years have really developed here. Just having time to work and really trying to understand the process. And going back to these dreams deferred works, I'm making all these works simultaneously in the studio. I'm making these paintings, I'm picking on the photographs, I'm making the oil, figurative oil paintings at the same time. And this is a solo presentation at Frieze London last fall of some of those works, my first full-on presentation of these works together. And there's a way for me to break up the monotony of the chain link fence on every painting I was making at the time, to where the dreams could be deferred without the visual obstacle. And more recently, in the past 2 weeks, I've unveiled a recent body of work called Melodies from a Running Spring. And it's works that I've produced over the past few years where I'm using sort of like a disposable camera and photographing friends or an interdisciplinary artist, Zachary Fabry and Daryl Homer, who's an Olympic fencer for Team USA. And really trying to get them in these movements of dance, and because I feel like they have a similar presence that capture these essence of these duppies. And again, these are going back to dreams that I've had and stories that I've been told, and really trying to understand this information that's been given to me, and how do I really put that out in a new light. And so over the years, I've thought about these works, I've photographed them and then sort of like collaged them together in Photoshop, and then made the physical works, and then picked them in the studio and completed them this year, earlier this year, where they were unveiled July 9th in Boston, Chicago, and New York. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. We have time for a few questions. If anyone has any, you can raise your hand and I'll bring you a mic. I also have a mic for the both of you. Don't grab at once. Anybody? Okay.
Thank you both so much for your wonderful talks. I had a question about, both of you spoke a lot about water and a lot about flowers, and I would like to ask you both to speak a little bit more about your relationship to water and flowers as kind of stand-ins for time and for people.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that question. I love it. I think for me, the water I was drawn to in this very visceral way. I think it's something that's so primal that to us. You talked about liking to be near the water. I'm the same. It's like this calming place. I think something different happens when a body is in water. Just thinking about photographing, like it physically changes, it emotionally changes. For me, things quiet and calm. I also love the rhythm and the presence. And I think the thing I think about the most with water, again, is that sort of immenseness and also constant motion, but also constant steadiness. For me, that's really a strong metaphor for our identities and who we are as people. I think the flowers for me are more about time and mortality, and I really began photographing flowers intensely during the pandemic. And for me, that was a way to reflect on time, mortality, relationships, like what happens when we as humans learn who we are by being in relationship with other people, and what happens when that's severed. You know, it's like it interrupted this fundamental part of our nature. And so I started making these flower portraits inside, and often in, you know, like winter light, or, you know, something else that was also referencing ephemerality and temporality. And I think truly for me, they're a way of just speaking about the preciousness of life, the limited time we have. Also a reference to immense beauty that you know is going to fade, right? How nothing can last, really. And how the takeaway for me from that is a positive one, like let's live as fully as we can in this moment because it's going to fade. And then when I put all those things in dialogue, the flowers and the water with the portraits, to me it also allows me to have this larger kind of poetic, subjective, personal take on like what it means to be alive. I mean, I feel like I'm becoming more cliche as I get further in my practice, but like all of my work is really like, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to love and be loved? What are we here for? Like, how much time do we have? And yeah, water and flowers for me are like really significant for speaking about those things.
I think she said everything that I wanted to say. But going back, when I was in the airport earlier with you, I was on a website. I went on your website, and I looked at some of those images, and I felt the calmness that you describe in the work. And I want to say that I love what you do. I just have to say that ahead of this. But for me, I think I've seen a lot of death. And coming from a place where I've seen rosaries on top of caskets, I have all my grandfather's images of my grandfather's casket. And so that's the first time I really was conscious that this is where I saw flowers. And I don't like to buy cut flowers. I hate doing it because it's like, again, they're gonna die. And you have to take them home and try to keep them alive. I like to see flowers like out in nature, right? And being in New York, I didn't understand seasons until I lived in Kansas City, coming from Miami. And so now I look forward to the seasons because every year, these flowers, they die off. I have a rose bush in the back of my house, and every couple weeks, they die off. And I'm always excited when the new buds come back up. And I'm looking forward to seeing them because, again, it's a reminder of death. Every time I see these flowers die, they're a very strong reminder of death. And think about watering them. Like, I try to water these plants, and it also is sad knowing that, you know, you can't help nature sometimes because nature's gonna do what nature's gonna do. And the water, I grew up by the water. I'm from the water. I grew up by a river. I grew up hearing stories about spirits in the water. I often tell my wife that water will find a way. During hurricanes, growing up in Miami and Jamaica, the water will go wherever it needs to go. Water is the strongest force. If it's combined with wind, it's even stronger. But I always think of stories of people in the Caribbean that drown because they don't know how to swim. My grandfather came from Cuba. He used to dive for fun, I was told. And so there's all these stories that sort of like bring me back to this calming moment when I'm by the water. And also my parents worked on a cruise ship in the 80s. And so as a child, I would have dreams of me drowning in water because I'm trying to get to them while they're sailing away. And there's just like, yeah, I just don't drink enough water.
Thank you both so much. I have a question for each of you. For Jess, well, I know you wanted to not talk about political stuff, so I'm sorry for my question. Okay, cool. I was just wondering what you would say to a younger queer artist who's just starting up their practice within this political like world that we live in now?
Yeah, thanks for that question. No, I'm very happy to talk about political things. I was just trying not to go down 18 million rabbit holes that could
Of
be opened up currently. You know, it's such a tricky time, and I think, at least I feel like I'm still wrapping my head around this moment and like daily processing new information. I mean, I think a lot of things. I think as artists, you just have to make what you're gonna make, right? Like, it's just in us, and we need to make the work that's important. And that's has to happen no matter what's going on in the world. You know, I've also made a lot of work with queer elders and trans elders, and so I often remind myself that like things have been more difficult, right? Like there was huge parts of our history with censoring or with laws or, you know, we don't know. But like my strategy has been to really double down on like presence and like love the people in my life and like love the work I'm making. It's almost like fueled me more to just focus on that. And at first it almost felt like not political to do that because there's so much going on, but I've really come to understand, I think that's
It in a meditative sense. And I remember when I first started making images with people or figures that I had a connection with, I did not like arriving into the studio and seeing them looking at me because it's sort of like them sort of like confronting me in a way where I would start to really think about them or pick up the phone and call someone who know them or try.
Are you using like a normal photographic inkjet paper and then somehow cutting it with a tool?
So that whole thing started here, right over there on this desk, on a desk here in this cafe or not cafe, room, where I started using my ceramic tool, the needle tool, and Andrew had allowed me to print a number of images during the residency, and I started scratching at them. And the scratching became more organized to where I was picking the halftones.
Actually removing a layer off the top?
It's sort of like picking and pulling up, so it's still somewhat intact. And I think the year after I left here, I worked at the Nelson Atkins Museum on the Hallmark photo collection. So I began looking at a lot of photos at the American photography history of America. And so when I left the studio, or left the museum, I would get to my studio and I'd start picking more strategically on the photographs. And then I began mounting the photographs on museum board. It started out as 4-ply museum board and 8-ply museum board. Now I do the museum board and cincher, now museum board and dye bond, and it's like now they're open face. And now the picking is so much more repetitive. And I have arthritis in my hand. I forgot my wrist brace, but it's like, it hurts, but it's like, going back to your question, it's like I'm trying to find something. I have like lots of images in my studio that I've mounted that I haven't even got to picking yet. But it's just something that I want to stop doing it, but it's kind of like, I have to do it, you know?
Any last questions? Oh,
I was curious as to like what drives the decision to like the level in which you disguise some of the images in like the subjects in your photos.
The level, huh? I think oftentimes the way I use photography, I'm very candid when I shoot a lot of my images. And sometimes, again, what you speak about is trust. And it's easier to work with images of individuals that trust is built. And then there's some times where, you know, the images are super candid and I just want to cover them up. And so there's all different levels of your connection with that person in that photograph. And so I'm still trying to understand what that is and how I, you know, how I cover them up. And even in the more recent images of the bus shelters, those two guys, I generally don't have people come home over to the house or apartment where I am, but I've had them over to share meals and break bread because we've been in dialogue for so long. And even some of the other people from old photographs, they know that I make artwork, but I never show them the images. And even the image that I first made here, you know, I sent my father and a copy, and he thought I was being disrespectful to him because it was an image of Emperor Haile Selassie from a 1964 image in Time magazine at the time. And so my father was a Rastafarian in his earlier days, and he thought I was making commentary on his life. And I was like, no, it's just an image I was testing out. And he's like, you're being disrespectful, this is not art. And I'm just like, okay, it's fine. You know, I don't have to keep, you know, the back and forth. It's just, I'm testing things out. So yeah, there's all different hierarchies in the making process for me.
Great. Thank you both so much. Just a reminder, 8:45 here for orientation. We'll see you then.